God has a plan for all of us, both as individuals and for humanity as a whole. When we think of Samson, we often think of a hero that was incredibly strong, but also full of moral failings. But Samson is part of a larger story, one about Israel losing their identity as God's people and conforming to the immoral patterns of nations around them. Samson's life, marked by continual sin, repetition of the same mistakes, and cycles of escalating violence, captures the bigger picture of Israel's unfaithfulness to God. Samson and Israel are caught in a downward spiral of sinfulness, and the only thing saving them from themselves and their enemies is the grace of God. God's plan for Samson was to use him as a leader to deliver his chosen people, Israel, from their enemies, the Philistines. But Samson's continual lust, anger, arrogance, and impulsiveness get the better of him and cost many innocent lives. Because Samson cares so little about God, God has to work in spite of him in order to accomplish his purpose. For example, Samson's marriage to a Philistine girl in Judges 14 is said to be from the Lord, because God was arranging an opportunity for Samson to cross paths with the oppressors he was supposed to be fighting back against. Samson does take the fight to the Philistines, but several otherwise innocent people lose their lives in brutal ways in the process. Samson eventually betrays his Nazirite vows, is stripped of his power, and is brought as a human trophy to the temple of the Philistine god, Dagon. Only when Samson acknowledges his need for God is he able to finally deal a devastating blow against his nation's oppressors, sacrificing himself in the process. Amid all this violence, bloodshed, and sin, what is there for us to learn? First, this story teaches us about God's grace. Despite all of our problems, God works through us, just as he did with Samson and with the nation of Israel. Despite continued sins and failures, God heard Israel when they called out to him for deliverance, and God heard Samson when he asked for help. God helps those who ask for his help, even if they don't deserve it. Also, we learn that God is faithful in accomplishing his purposes, even when people are unfaithful. Like Samson, how many times do we stray from God's plan for us? Samson regularly turned aside from God's plans and followed his own. And every time he did so, it got him into trouble. But even though Samson was always running away from God's plan had a way of being fulfilled anyway. This story did not end well for Samson. He died humiliated, blinded, and alone amongst his bitterest enemies. His life could have gone differently. He could have saved Israel and his own life if he had followed a more righteous path, but God had to work with the mess of a man that Samson was. In many ways, the story of Samson is more about God than it is about Samson. Samson was little more than a man who was chosen by God to do great things. Samson at his core was just a man with long hair, but God chose him for a higher purpose. Samson failed to use the power God gave him for a divine purpose, but Samson's failure could not stop God from saving Israel. Author C.S. Lewis once said, "You will certainly carry out God's purpose, however you act, but it makes a difference to you whether you serve like Judas or like John." Jesus died at least in part because Judas betrayed him. Through the cross, God achieved salvation for the world, but Judas was still wrong to betray his friend. While God has a unique plan for all of us, we probably aren't called to liberate nations, but God might call us to be a blessing to those less fortunate, to share kindness and love with those who need it, and uplift those who are struggling. God might be calling us to volunteer at a community center, tutor younger students, build relationships with people from other cultures, or to stand up for what is right when the whole world insists on going wrong. But even after all of our mistakes, God is still there, like he was for Samson. We will trip and fall, have a life of highs and lows, but through it all, God will remain faithful. The question is, will you end up on God's side?